Hey guys, welcome to the next installment here in American History Lectures, and today we're going to take a look at a very controversial set of issues here that are taking place during the Roaring Twenties. And we're really going to try to focus on here the conflicts that are taking place as far as society, which is changing. There's a certain level of root intolerance and racism that's taking place, and also there is some disputes on the ideas of religion and freedom of speech and so forth. So we're going to hit on a bunch of controversial topics. I'm going to do my best to try to keep it as non-controversial as possible, and not step on any toes, and just kind of give you just the basis of what each of these are, and to better understand what controversy is taking place, so you can better form your opinions around those topics. So we know that definitely that the 1920s was a period of change, and we're moving into kind of this new leisured form time period with the flapper culture called the Jazz Age, and there's a number of people who are moving more into the urbanized areas. And for the first time in American history, we can see this here in the graph here in the bottom right-hand corner, that for the first time in the 1920s, we have more Americans living in urban areas than rural areas, and that's going to be huge. And even just as we so see today, is that these two areas or these two parts of America have completely different cultures as far as the norm. We know this as far as political, social, and so forth, that the average person living in a rural area tends to have different views than the average person living in an urban area, and it's still the same way today. And as these rural Americans are or as these people are moving to the urban areas, the people of rural America and more conservative America see that these urban areas almost as un-American or untraditionally American. And whether that is talking about the way that they act, the things they do, the people they hang out or associate with, the things they do for their leisure time, the consumption of alcohol. We'll see that a lot more alcohol is being consumed in the major cities than in the rural areas. And even just, the way they conduct themselves, the way they dress and so forth, all these things are being kind of viewed differently, again, from the urban areas than the rural areas. So the first one here we're going to take a look at is prohibition. And we know that under the 18th Amendment, or what's known as the Volstead Act, prohibition is going to be enforced, and essentially the buying and selling of alcohol, the consumption of the production of alcohol is going to be banned. And rural Americans is really kind of where this idea is coming from. These noble experiences, we talked about Carrie Nation being somebody who would go to the saloons and try to combat the saloon culture, because they believe that the alcohol caused people to be sinful, that it caused Americans high rates of crime, and that by banning alcohol, it would basically try to progress or try to fix society. And this is going to cause a huge rift or a huge divide between rural and urban America. And the U.S. Treasury Department is the one who's going to be enforcing, or who's going to be in charge of enforcing, this Volstead Act, or the Act of Prohibition. And they would raid businesses, they would raid distillers and confiscate alcohols and so forth, punishing those. You can see here that they're draining all the alcohol out of the barrels, making sure that this is not being sold or get distributed to the other Americans. And they would have these task force, these police forces that are going out and trying to stop the consumption of alcohol, essentially. And we can see here that the original rates of alcohol consumption do decline as prohibition is becoming legalized and eventually becomes law in 1921. It's at an all-time low, where the average American is drinking about 0.2 gallons of alcohol a year. And then it's going to skyrocket back upwards, and will kind of hover around 1.2, 1.4. Now this is going to be also slightly lower than what it was prior to Prohibition, but it did not really do the job that it was meant to do as far as trying to slow or stop the consumption of alcohol by Americans. And there's going to be many urban Americans who are going to resist prohibition. The people who are living in the major cities that have this kind of uptown style of life, whether it be the flappers or so forth, or even many immigrants, impoverished immigrants who are coming over to the New World, who are used to, in certain places, especially in poorer parts of Eastern Europe, where essentially all you do drink is alcohol because of the lack of clean water that you have ready available for you. It's very difficult to get them to buy into this idea of not drinking alcohol, this prohibition agenda. And very many times, or very oftentimes, these illegal bars are being set up, or restaurants will also have illegal bars underneath them called speakeasies, where they're basically breaking the Volstead Act by secretly having people drink and consume alcohol. And you can see some pictures here of the speakeasies, and the idea of this, again, was trying to secretly ban against the Volstead Act. And you would have these police forces by the Department of Treasury who are going around trying to find and crack down on these speakeasies who are still considering or who are still consuming and distilling alcohol. Now, as far as the demand for alcohol, this is not going to change, and it's going to lead to the illegal use of bootlegging, and from things like moonshining, crime, high rates of death, or illegal activities, smuggling as well. We're going to see that these are some of the negative aspects of prohibition, the unintended consequences, that the idea of prohibition was to reduce crime. Well, it actually increases crime. That it was supposed to decrease disease and sickness. Well, it actually increases it because people are now drinking very poor alcohol or very toxic alcohol rates under these illegal moonshiners that are taking place. Under prohibition, organized crime is going to emerge, especially in the major cities, and you have these certain enclaves, whether it be the Italians, the Russians, and so forth, or even just Americans, who are, the mafia is taking on the illegal alcohol trade, who are bringing in alcohol from other places around the world, who are smuggling it in via trade, who are distilling and bootlegging it themselves and selling it across state lines. And obviously, the most notorious of this is the mobster Al Capone, who did this in the city of Chicago and really kind of controlled the city of Chicago itself, and really kind of led to a huge rate of crime in the city. And when you have these high rates of crime, or you have an illegal activity that leads to the black market, you tend to have other crime that comes along with it. And the idea of this would be the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where mobsters were and gang killings were happening to control the liquor trade. So they're essentially killing each other to try to one up each other in these reigns, or in this kind of race to the top to try to control the alcohol trade. As you can see here in the picture that is included, by the end of the 1920s, most Americans do no longer support prohibition. They can kind of see the unintended consequences that came with it and how it actually caused more problems than what it was trying to solve. And so, although you still have a bulk of people who are defending it in the rural areas, for the most part in major cities, it is no longer a supported, if it ever even was a supported idea, and people want it banned. People want it to be taken away. And with that, as we mentioned before with Tom Ritchie, the 21st Amendment is going to be ratified during FDR's term during the Great Depression, in order to kind of repeal prohibition, to try to bring back that sort of business and try to stimulate the economy in some instance. But it's going to be seen as a failure, a social experiment that was a failure for the prohibitionists or the temperance movements like Carrie Nation. All right, so the next topic that we're going to talk about here is the different rates of intolerance and racism and ethnocentrism and so forth that are taking place during this time period. The rise of the KKK will happen once again. So let's go ahead and kind of see what is taking place here and how this is aligned with the context of the 1920s. So if you remember back to our last video when we talked about the different rates of immigration that were taking place during the Gilded Age, and we have these huge amounts because there are no quotas for the most part. The Chinese Exclusion Act is the only exception to that, that we have hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming in from different parts of the world, and different groups of Americans will start to kind of give rein to this idea of nativism that we talked about, this idea that immigrants coming over are un-American, who are stealing jobs, and especially from those places that are coming in that are seen as non-Protestant, that are seen as backwards or uncivilized, that are seen as non-Western, or that are seen as potentially communist. They are seen as a threat, and this nativism is a way to try to combat that and try to protect them, what they see as America, real Americans, and also protect jobs for what they consider to be real Americans. We briefly mentioned that at the end of World War I, it briefly sparks this idea of the Red Scare, and that will continue into the 1920s. The slow rise of the Socialist Party under Eugene Debs is going to kind of see that people are mostly afraid of the Bolsheviks or the communist Reds from Russia coming over to the United States and kind of having the same style of revolution that we saw in Russia that took place to create the Soviet Union. And during this time period, we see that many immigrants are under attack who are seen as un-American, who are seen as a potential threat to national security because of where they're coming from and the idea that they might have some sort of ties to these anarchical or these communist governments. And an example of this would be the Sacco and Vanzetti case, who were a pair of Italian immigrants who were seen as anarchists, and in some instances they were, and they were arrested and charged with robbery and murder. And again, remember think about the time period that we're in. Forensics is not really a huge idea as far as crimes and trying to solve crimes, and with very little circumstantial evidence, they were both found guilty and were executed, and it was seen as more of a way of trying to limit and trying to put a tamper down on people who were seen as dangerous rather than actually the idea of innocent until proven guilty. And by today's standards, this would definitely have been a abuse of power by the judicial branch as a way to kind of have a political point made against immigrants during this time period. So again, we mentioned that during the Gilded Age, there was a really kind of an open immigration idea that if you were willing to come and you were working, that you were seen as safe, you were able to come in, you were able to do that. However, ideas of nativism kind of come to fruition in Congress, and there will be multiple instances in the 1920s where quotas are put on how many immigrants can come to the United States each year. And you can see that here in the political cartoon with Uncle Sam kind of using a funnel to limit the amount of immigrants who are coming over from Europe. And with these quota laws, a lot of times they're going to be seen as ways to try to limit and almost targeting certain areas of Europe, areas that were seen as more dangerous potentially because of communism or because of anarchism, or the idea that these people from southeastern Europe are less American, coming over from, let's say, Italy or Greece, or the Balkans areas, that they are seen as less American than those coming over from places like Germany or England. And we can see that as what we talked about during the Gilded Age, that became more and more immigrants coming from southeastern Europe. And with these laws that you can see here, once the quotas are put in place, it kind of reverses that effect, because the quotas were larger for these areas like Germany, Ireland, England than it was for the Eastern European countries. So to continue with the idea of the intolerance that was taking place in the 1920s, one of the most, I don't want to use the word influential because that makes it sound positive, but one of the most notorious, I guess, books that are written during this time period is Birth of a Nation. And a movie and novel is going to be created where kind of portrays the Klansmen as these almost Batman-like figures going around and these protecting virtue and avenging the immigrants, the evils that are coming in, and also obviously with different groups that are not seen as white and American. And this is kind of going to give a rise to the KKK again, which have died off essentially after the end of Reconstruction. And for those who are joining the KKK, a lot of them are using these fear tactics to try to discriminate against immigrants, Black Americans, Catholics, Jews, communists, anybody who was seen again as not pure or not American in their instance. And we're going to see from the Birth of a Nation movement that an increase in membership will take place in the 1920s. So you can see here by the mid 1920s, they had about 4.5 million members, and that multiple states are going to be using their influence or having people who are openly in line with the KKK, whether they took support or they just were had support of them as far as monetary or political support or so forth. You can see as far as whether they were governors or senators who were elected with the support of the KKK, and the kind of the modern KKK that we think of with the creating, I believe, in Indiana. You can see having a lot more influence in those states as well. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about is that we tend to think that somehow that the KKK is something that is only taking place in the South, that somehow the South is more racist than the other parts, and that can sometimes be misconstrued because what we think of with the historical context of slavery and the Civil War. However, as far as the KKK, you can see that it's in northern states as well, all the way up to Maine, states who had always been free. So again, we talk about where even though the southern states having Jim Crow and having segregation is awful, when these people would go to the major cities in Chicago, in New York, in Boston, wherever it might be, by no stretch does that mean that their life is perfect, that that somehow discrimination does not take place. All that means is that the segregation laws are not on the books in the same instance that it is in the South.